Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Fracknoy. I'm the astronomy instructor here at Foothill College in Los Altos Hills, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome everyone here in the Smithwick Auditorium and everyone watching us at home on your computer to this, the first lecture in the 15th annual Silicon Valley Astronomy Lecture Series. This series is co-sponsored by NASA's Ames Research Center, one of the premier NASA centers in the United States for both science and education. By the Foothill College Astronomy Program, we offer astronomy classes both in the day and evening in what we call our Astronomy for Poets program. We offer classes for people who are not technically inclined, but just have a romantic interest in the universe. Also, the program is co-sponsored by the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, which is an organization just celebrating its 125th anniversary, bringing news about astronomy to teachers, students, amateur astronomers, and the public at large. And last but not least, we are co-sponsored by the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Institute, the leading organization, scientific organization in the US, searching for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence. And we're very grateful for the help of all these organizations. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Caleb Scharf, who is the Director of Astrobiology at Columbia University in New York City. He's one of the leading scholars at the interface of astronomy and biology in this relatively new field that we call astrobiology. He's the author of a widely praised book called Gravity's Engines, which was the basis of a BBC documentary called Swallowed by a Black Hole. His textbook, Extrasolar Planets and Astrobiology, won the 2011 Chambliss Prize for the Best Astronomy Textbook. In addition to over 100 scientific research papers, Dr. Scharf has written non-technical articles for such magazines as Scientific American, The New Yorker, Science, and many other publications, and he's been frequently interviewed on television and radio. His latest book, The Copernicus Complex, was just published by Scientific American, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and it is that book which is the topic of his talk tonight. Then, looking in the largest of scales at our place in the universe, it's a great pleasure for me to present Dr. Caleb Scharf.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. It's wonderful to see so many faces in the audience. Thank you for coming out to have an evening that may be a little different than the usual evening, sitting around watching television or drinking beer. At least that's what I do usually. Because tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some very big questions. Big questions that are not only ancient, but they're very deep. They're questions that speak to the most fundamental aspects of our existence. So what do I mean by this? Well, let me start with just a little taster of where we're going to go. Let me talk a little bit about significance or insignificance. And a good place to begin is with me. This is me. I think I was around 1 year old. And let's think about my place in the universe. There I am. I was born here in a city. Some of you may recognize it from some of the artifacts in this image. It's the city of London. And the city of London is, of course, on a small island in a great ocean on a planet, which is a rocky sphere covered in a thin veneer of atmosphere and water. And that planet has a companion shown to scale here. The Earth is at the lower left of this image. The moon is up there at the top right. And around the time that picture of me was taken, you can gauge how old I am from this, humans went there, and we came back again. A total round trip of about 500,000 miles. And that's all we did. which is perhaps not surprising because all of that is in that little dot where the blue arrow is on the lower right-hand side there. That little dot is orbiting a fairly ordinary star, the Sun, shown up there, at a distance of about 93 million miles. And that star, the Sun, is merely one of several hundred billion stars in a great swirl of matter that we call the Milky Way galaxy. And the Milky Way galaxy has some companions. It's companion to a galaxy called Andromeda, in a small grouping of galaxies. But these are not the only galaxies, because across the universe there are some 300 to 400 billion galaxies within the region of the universe that we call the observable universe, that we have mapped out to a certain distance. This is a map where each little tiny dot is a known galaxy. If we could see the entire observable universe, it might look something like this. The observable universe is the place from which light has had time to reach us in the last 13.8 billion years. So it's a big place. But we now have some reason to believe that this may not be the only universe. There may be other universes out there separated in space and time and dimension with different properties. In fact, there may be 10 to the 10 to the 16 distinguishable universes out there. And this is a number determined solely by the information carrying capacity of the human brain over a human lifetime. The actual potential number of other universes out there that we couldn't tell the difference between is about 10 to the 10 to the 10 to the 7. So, are we special or unique? Are we at all significant? In light of all this, it can seem pretty obvious that the answer has to be, how can we be significant? How can me and my little baby pram back in the late 1960s possibly be at all significant? And it's an important question to ask, though, because the interesting thing is that the answer isn't quite as simple as you might be led to believe from what I just showed you. And this is what we're going to talk about this evening, because the answer to these sorts of questions can be yes, no, and of course it's not so simple. And that's really the story of science. It's never quite so simple. So where do we begin? Well, what I'm going to do during the course of the next 50 minutes or so is try to discuss both sides of this equation, to talk about things that suggest that, yeah, we're not special, we're insignificant, and things that suggest, well, maybe there is something a little unusual about us, about life on Earth. So where do we begin? Well, let's begin with this guy. This is actually a 19th century picture of Copernicus, portraying him as he might have been in the 1500s. So it's a rather romanticized view of him having sudden enlightenment on some rooftop somewhere, surrounded by suitably placed maps and tools. Copernicus, some 500 years ago, really took what we would recognize to be the tools of modern science and applied them to understand the mechanics of our solar system. And in doing so, he removed the Earth from the center of existence. He was trying to explain the movements of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars in the sky. It was a very mechanistic problem that he was trying to solve in a more elegant way than had been done before. And to do that, he put the sun at the center. But he also thought more deeply about the implications of this. And he even said, and this is an almost exact quote from Copernicus's writings, there is no one center in the universe. Now, this is an astonishing thing to say 500 years ago. Of course, his conception of the universe was rather different than ours. He was really thinking about, essentially, the solar system. He wasn't even really thinking about what the stars might truly be and where they truly were. But this notion that there is no centrality, there's no special place in the universe, was incredibly important. And over the decades and centuries that followed Copernicus, it like a snowball rolling down the hill, it gathered momentum, and it turned into a very important and central piece of Western science, this notion. In fact, when Einstein and others were trying to apply the tools of general relativity to understand the dynamics of the universe as a whole, this was a critically important idea, that there is no particular spatial center to the universe. The universe is expanding everywhere at the same time. And this has given rise to what we might now call the principle of cosmic mediocrity, which is to say that we are definitely not special, but no place in the universe is special. That's the principle of cosmic mediocrity. And it applies certainly when we're trying to understand the dynamics of the universe, but it's also a very sort of comfortable thing in terms of modern science. And the interesting thing about the principle of cosmic mediocrity is that it also suggests that the circumstances of the Earth and of life on Earth are also not special. Right? That has to be true if we believe in cosmic mediocrity. But that kind of implies that there should be life everywhere, because if we're cosmically mediocre, there has to be lots of other cosmically mediocre stuff out there that's equivalent in some way. So on the face of it, this suggests we're not significant, of course, we're not special, we're mediocre. But it's also saying there should be life everywhere. And that's interesting, because that's something we might be able to test. So let's think a little further about this. Let's go to the other side of the equation. Because a lot of the modern discussion of, maybe life is special, maybe there is something special about the Earth, actually came out of physics. And in particular, something that has become known as the anthropic principle. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit here. I'll also show why it may not be correct, or at least it may be more complicated. So in the late 20th century, actually around about the 1970s, we had learned that the universe was finite in age, it's expanding. But a number of physicists were also seeing that there were central properties of the universe, central features of the universe, and I'll put up a list here. This looks kind of complicated, so don't worry, don't panic. We'll talk about a couple of these very briefly. I'm just putting the list up there for completeness. A number of physicists had noticed that if you looked at certain fundamental characteristics of the universe, which were otherwise completely independent of each other, and for which there was no deeper underlying predictive theory to say what they should be, so things like the relative strength of gravity to electromagnetic forces, for example, or the amount of energy that you get out when you fuse two nuclei together. Some of those fundamental properties or fundamental constants of nature are all sort of lined up in such a way that life can exist. What do I mean? Well, take, for example, the strength of gravity compared to the strength of electromagnetic forces. If you changed that relationship just a little bit, you might not make stars in the universe. And stars make heavy elements like carbon, and we're made of carbon chemistry. So if you change something a little bit in the fundamental underpinnings of the universe, you subvert the whole pathway to life like us. And there are other things, for example, the size of quantum variations in the early universe. What does that mean? Well, tiny imperfections in the very, very young universe that have actually grown into all the structure that we see in the cosmos. Change that a bit, and the universe turns out different, and we wouldn't be here. So these physicists said, well, this is kind of interesting. This says that the existence of life itself is telling us something about fundamental physics. It's telling us about the fundamental characteristics of the universe. That means life is kind of special. And you only need one instance of life in the universe for this to be true. Now, you may be sitting there, and I hope you're sitting there going, well, wait a minute, because if it weren't like this, if things weren't finely tuned in this way, we wouldn't be here to make the observation in the first place. So it has to be like this. And that's true, except if this is the once and only universe, why did it turn out this way? That's a disquieting thought. It's an uncomfortable thought. Well, is this true? Is this the once and only universe? Now, this comes back to something I mentioned just a few slides ago. There's a way out of this. There's a way to get back to a sort of cosmic mediocrity, which is say, well, maybe this isn't the totality. It's just a tiny piece of this multiverse, okay, that we're one of 10 to the 10 to the 16 distinguishable universes. And so it's not surprising that we find ourselves in a universe that is suitable for life. It just happens to be one of those many, many universes that is suitable for life. It's just got the right sort of fertility. So of course we find ourselves here. So that seemingly solves this notion of being special. But there's something in there that's a little tricky, because it doesn't actually help us with the question of our significance within this universe, because it only requires, the idea of the anthropic principle only requires one instance of life having occurred in the universe to be true. And multiverse theories, and they are theories, they're very compelling theories, some of them, but they are theories. There is no experimental verification yet. They don't say anything about how much life you might expect anywhere. Now, you might say, well, why should they? They're just physics theories. And that's true, but yeah, we want to know the answer to this. We want to evaluate our place in the universe. And we'd certainly like to know whether it's just us or there are others. And I'll come back to this right at the end of the talk. There's some connection, there's a deep connection between how much life there might be in a universe, in other words, how fertile a universe is, the abundance of life, and some of this deeper physics. So, is there an easier way to get to the answers, to begin to evaluate our place in the universe properly, to evaluate our significance, whether we're special or not? Well, yes, of course there is. It's around us. We just have to look out into the cosmos to begin to understand these things. So let's do that. And what I'm going to do first is just to take a tiny little trip to the side to think a bit about the passage of time. Because in all these discussions about how much life there is in the universe and whether we're special or not, we often leave out the piece of it that is actually very, very important, which is that things change in the universe. So let me just do a quick 3-minute history of us, our entire 10 billion year history. Now, we've only got through about sort of 4.5 billion years of that history. We have a bit more to come. So let's do it all. So where do we come from? Well, we come from a place like this. This is a picture of the Trifid Nebula. It's about 5,000 light years away from us in our galaxy. It's a great collection of gas and dust. This image is about 150 trillion miles across. And it's places like these in our galaxy where gas and dust in interstellar space is beginning to condense together, pulled together by its own weight and pulled together because it's able to cool down. It's beginning to condense out of interstellar space. And if we look deep in images like these, peering inside, this is a Hubble Space Telescope image, we see all these extraordinary structures and increasingly dense accumulations of gas and dust. And if we can peer really, really deeply in, we see these almost egg-like regions, very, very dense regions where material is falling together very rapidly on cosmic timescales. Rapidly enough that it begins to form new stars. And a new star, and the next image will be a computer animation, a rendition. New stars, we think, form in this sort of situation. They form as matter condenses out of the interstellar medium. At the center of this image is a forming star, a protostar. Matter falling onto it, it's getting hotter and hotter, and it's squeezing itself down to the point where it begins nuclear fusion. Surrounding it is a great swirling disk of material, primarily gas with some dust mixed in. It's about 20 billion miles across, give or take, if we're looking back at the history of our own solar system. And in that disk of swirling material around this growing star, matter begins to clump together into solids. There is dust that clumps with other dust. There are ices that form. And these pieces begin to accumulate and fit together to make larger and larger objects. While it's happening, though, the central star is getting hotter and hotter, and it's boiling everything away. So in fact, this all takes place very rapidly, and in merely, for our solar system, 95 million years or so, give or take, I'm sure it's more uncertain than that, but let's say 95 million years after we take that egg-shaped piece out of a nebula, watch it collapse under its own weight, we end up with, well, a star, the sun, and some fossils. And here are the fossils. And we're that fossil. Or well, rather, we live on that fossil. Well, actually, we are that fossil, because the material we are composed of have come from that fossil. This is what you get after 95 million years. And arguably, the most interesting piece of the history of the solar system happened 4.57 billion years ago when the star started to form. 95 million years after that, it was all over. It's boring. It's been downhill ever since. And of course, where we exist, some 4.57 billion years after that initial period of formation, is kind of an in-between time, and it's not going to stay this way for too long. In another billion years or so, our sun will have gotten sufficiently bright that the surface temperature of the Earth, no matter how you do it, how you change the atmosphere, will not be able to sustain liquid water. That will probably be the end of life as we know it. Now, of course, in a billion years' time, we're pretty unlikely to be around. Even if our descendants still are, they will be different from us. Okay? Evolution will force that to happen. And if we go a little bit further, another 4 billion years after that, what's going to happen? Well, basically, the sun is going to inflate its outer layers. It will finish burning nuclear fuel, the hydrogen nuclear fuel in its core. It will go through a period of transformation over another few hundred million years. It will end up as a giant crystallizing ball of carbon and oxygen. The Earth may or may not still exist, and that's it. 10 billion years, and it's over and done. But during that 10 billion year span, another 10 billion or so stars have formed in the Milky Way galaxy. So we really exist in a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of time, and during the rest of that time, the galaxy continues to produce stars and other things. Now, one thing that we have not known until recently is whether or not those other stars, either the 10 billion that formed during the solar system's 10 billion year lifespan, or that have already formed, whether those other stars also have planets around them. And it's difficult to find planets. Planets are small and dark, and stars are big and bright, and if you put the two of them together on the sky, it's enormously difficult to see planets because the light of the star swamps them. However, this has all changed. And it started about 20 years ago. We now know, through a variety of incredibly clever technological tricks to detect or sense the presence of planets around other stars. I won't go into any detail on this, but I'm sure you can read about it, and if you haven't already read about it. We now know of over 4,000 planets. We have robust detections of the presence of more than 4,000 planets around other stars. One of the ways in which this has been done has involved the NASA Kepler mission, which was a space telescope that monitored the tiny dips in light of about 150,000 stars due to planets orbiting around them and occasionally passing between us and those parent stars. And you can monitor those tiny dips in light. The point is that we've discovered many, many planets out there, and we simply did not know if this was going to be the case. More than 20 years ago, we might have speculated that planets might be fairly common, but we didn't know. We really didn't know. And it's now got to the point where you can have headlines like this. It's New York Times, it must be correct. Far-off planets like the Earth dot the galaxy. And it's true, because we've detected enough planets to begin to make statistical extrapolations that mean something. So we know that the universe makes planets in great abundance, There are hundreds of billions of other planets in our galaxy, the Milky Way. In fact, there are roughly 1.4 planets for every star in the Milky Way galaxy, probably more than that. We can also begin to make statements about planets that could conceivably resemble the Earth in some way. So, for example, we can take our measurements and make statistical extrapolations to say that we're pretty confident that within about 20 light years of us, which is really pretty nearby, that's nearly 120 trillion miles of us, there's at least one candidate Earth-like planet. Well, what does that mean? Well, it really just means a planet of about the same size as the Earth orbiting its parent star at a distance that could allow for the presence of liquid water on the surface, the so-called Goldilocks zone or habitable zone. And that means that there are at least something like 15 billion such worlds just in our galaxy. So this kind of gets us back to feeling mediocre, perhaps, at least in terms of planets like this. However, there's a twist to the story. And the twist is to do, to some extent, with the incredible diversity of these other worlds. Let me just run through this. This is going to be a quick laundry list of some of the diversity that we see in other planets. For example, there are things called hot Jupiters. These are gas giant planets like Jupiter that orbit their parent stars incredibly closely. Some of them go around their parent stars in less than 24 Earth hours. It's still a bit of a mystery how they end up there. There are planets that we think are ocean planets, planets that have a much larger water abundance than the Earth. So there may be oceans hundreds of miles deep covering these planets. There are super-Earths, planets that are essentially rocky worlds, but they are more massive than the Earth, but not quite as massive as Neptune. And there isn't one of those in our solar system, something I'll come back to in a moment. There are planets with hydrogen envelopes. Now, some of you may not be very excited by that. Okay, but I can assure you astronomers and planetary scientists are excited by that because these planets with hydrogen envelopes, hydrogen atmospheres, are otherwise small rocky planets, but they have these enormous hydrogen and probably helium atmospheres. We have really no idea how they got those, but they're out there. There are planets that are incredibly carbon rich. We can already make that deduction, and those planets would have fundamentally different geophysics and geochemistry, not dominated by silicates, but dominated by carbon instead. There are, where are we? Rogue planets. Okay, so this really just throws it out the window. These are planets that have no parent star. What are they doing? These are planets that we think used to have a parent star, formed around a parent star in that great swirl of material that I showed you the animation of, but have somehow been flung out into interstellar space. And there are a lot of them. There could be as many of these planets as there are stars. Okay. There are planets doing the most perverse things imaginable. In our own solar system, all the planets orbit in the same sense that the sun spins. That kind of makes sense if you look at that picture of the swirling disk of material forming planets and stars. But then we find planets that are going in the wrong direction. What are they doing? We have ideas, but we still don't know for sure. There are planets that probably have great layers of diamond inside them. There are so-called packed systems. There are systems where planets seem to have formed to a maximal amount, as if nature couldn't get enough of making planets, and it put them all closely together in orbits where if they were a little bit closer together, it would all disrupt. So for example, there are places where we think there may be 9 planets all within the equivalent orbit of the Earth. There are planets going around twin suns. This is a fabulous piece of science fiction made real. There are binary stars, twin stars, that have planets not just orbiting one of those stars, but orbiting around both of them at the same time. There are Icarus worlds, planets on orbits that are so elongated that during the course of one orbit, their temperature can change by 1,000 degrees. There are planets on hugely elliptical orbits. Our own solar system has orbits that are relatively circular and spread out. There are many systems, in fact, the majority of systems have strongly elliptical orbits that relates, we think, to the deeper dynamical history of planetary systems. And then the last one up here, pitch black worlds. I like these. Pitch black worlds. These are gas-rich planets whose atmospheric chemistry is such that it absorbs almost all the light that falls on them. They are darker than the darkest piece of coal. It's a lot of diversity. The interesting thing is that all of this information now gives us a way in which to gauge our solar system against others. It gives us a set of fingerprints, if you will. So let's just do that. How does our solar system actually stack up against these others in terms of, is it common or is it not common? Well, I'm going to do this very crudely, but just to show you some of the things we can look at. So for example, if we look at the types of orbits of the planets in our solar system, the architecture of our solar system, and the stability of these orbits, not just now, but in the past and in the future, we find that we kind of belong to a 25% club. Most systems are somewhat different. If we look at the fact that we don't have one of those super-Earth planets, 60% of stars, we think, have a super-Earth around them, yet that type of planet does not exist in our solar system. So it puts us in a sort of 40% club. And then something that was kind of staring us in the face all along, but we didn't know until we found out that there were planets around other stars. The sun, while an ordinary star, is not the most common type of star in the galaxy. Most stars are less massive than the sun. In fact, 75% of all stars are less than half the mass of the sun, and this kind of puts us in a slightly unusual club because those lower mass stars also have planets around them. And of course, we have this planet that we're sitting on in this habitable or Goldilocks zone. It's orbiting at a distance from its parent star that allows for the existence of liquid water on the surface, and liquid water, we think, may be a prerequisite for life. So taken all together, very crudely, and this is very, very crude, kind of suggests our solar system is a bit of a 1 in 100 type place. It's not completely rare, but it's kind of unusual. That's interesting. Whenever you see something like this, a flag goes up. But we don't know how that relates to the existence of life here, at least not yet. But it's interesting. It is a check in the column for perhaps there's something special here. So to go to the next piece of this, and this is where, you know, as astronomy-related talks go, I'm going way left field, okay? Because to understand some of that, we also have to think about life itself. We have to go to the innerverse. I'm not sure if that's a particularly good word, but it sounded kind of cool. And the innerverse is to do with the nature of life. So let's have a little think about the nature of life on the Earth. So let's look at life on Earth. Now, I'm pretty sure this is the only astronomy talk you ever see that has a picture of a cow in it. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe there's a cow trend. Not so long ago, 50, 100 years ago, if you asked someone, if you stopped someone on the street and you said, what's life on Earth? Tell me, what is it? What constitutes life on Earth? They might say, well, maybe it's cows and animals and grass and trees and insects, stuff like that is what dominates life. Well, not exactly. So let's consider a cow. So a cow consists of about 10 trillion cow cells. And cow cells, like our cells, are quite complex. They have a lot of complex structures in them, and they're all glued together, literally glued together. So a cow is 10 to the 13 complex cells glued together. But that's not all that a cow is, because a cow is also about 100 trillion simple microbial cells. Microbial meaning single-celled organisms, the bacteria, or the other great branch of single-celled organisms, the archaea. Like us, we're the same. Large multicellular life on this planet carries around an enormous microbiome. It carries around microbes, bacteria, and archaea. And we can't exist without them. They help us digest our food. They are related to our immune system. They're to do with our biochemistry. They're part of us. In fact, a typical adult human, and if you're squeamish, I apologize, carries around roughly 2 pounds in weight of pure microbial life. That's kind of a blob like this, sort of squishy blob like, well, you can use your imagination. Now, it's very interesting. It's become a central piece at the forefront of medical research and biological research to understand the interplay between this microbial life and creatures like us and the cow and other things, because we can't exist without each other. Some of these microbes, we are their habitat. Take us away and they won't be able to survive. The reason for bringing this up is that the same pattern extends to the planet as a whole. The majority of life on Earth is microbial. It's single-celled organisms. They are, in numbers, at least 10 to the 30 individuals living at any one moment. They are extremely genetically diverse, far more genetically diverse than larger creatures, and they're everywhere. They're not just on this remote or on my skin, in my stomach, or out here in the lecture room. They're in the atmosphere, they're in the oceans, they're in the soil, they're in the rock. They've been found kilometers down in the substructure of the Earth's crust. They are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. And that is very important because the environment that we live in today and the environment of the Earth over the last 4 billion years or so has been fully intertwined with these organisms. The microbes were the first recognizable life that we know of on the planet, and they have remained the dominant type of life on the planet. And they have essentially engineered and re-engineered the planet over time, depending on what was thrown at them from other things, other events. They have manipulated and shaped the planetary environment for the last 4 billion years, and we are proof of that. The oxygen we breathe is proof of that. The production of oxygen through photosynthesis was invented by microbes probably at least 3.5, 3.8 billion years ago. Now, you'll see where I'm going with this, I hope. It's complicated. Biology is complicated. I'm sorry, I'm a poor astronomer. Biology is complicated, but it's fascinating. One of the ways in which we can conceptualize what they've done to the environment is to think about the biological processes that are particularly relevant for altering the environment. And these are processes that we call metabolism. And all life on Earth uses a finite set of metabolic tools. Okay, so metabolic tools are ways in which organisms extract energy from the environment, ways in which they extract energy and raw materials from the environment. So, for example, we are oxygen respirators. That's our primary metabolic process. There are organisms whose primary metabolic process is fermentation, something near and dear to my heart, perhaps some of you too. Things like nitrogen fixation. Okay, and then more exotic-sounding metabolic processes like iron respiration or manganese respiration undertaken by certain microbes, some of which live on the surface of desert rocks. Altogether, there are about 10 metabolic processes that life uses altogether, and most of life is microbial. The genetic code that describes the molecular machinery that organisms use to carry out these particular metabolic processes is relatively small. It's about 1,500 genes, key genes. And these have become known as the core planetary gene set in certain circles. So what is interesting about the core planetary gene set? Well, the really extraordinary thing is that this set of genes is widely dispersed across microbial life. Individual microbes may operate, for example, by doing fermentation. That's how they survive. But they may carry other parts of the core planetary gene set, genes that, for example, might do oxygenic photosynthesis or something else. They just don't use those genes. And because microbes are everywhere, and have been everywhere for a long time, over time they are essentially the guardians of this core planetary gene set, which is if in a way you could look at it as the solution that life has found for surviving on this planet. The interesting thing about that is if an asteroid comes along and hits the Earth and destroys 99.9% of life, it's okay. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. Because somewhere the core planetary gene set will be preserved. It may be shared across a number of microbes somewhere, but it only takes a handful of these things lurking under a rock somewhere, and you haven't lost that information. life doesn't need to reinvent the metabolic tools to exist, which may be pointing towards something universal. It's a way in which life can survive for billions of years on a planet. And those same metabolic processes are tied into chemistry, carbon chemistry, that we see the building blocks of everywhere in the universe. We see carbon chemistry on planets, asteroids, interstellar gas, you name it. It is ubiquitous. If you look out into interstellar space, 70 to 80% of all molecules that are floating out there are carbon-based molecules, and they're kind of things we would recognize. They are the precursors to things like amino acids. So what am I trying to say? Well, and this is this was the most complicated part of this talk. It's suggestive that all of this together is a plausible blueprint for how planetary life may have to operate anywhere and how it can operate incredibly successfully, irrespective of the biochemical details. Because what life seems to have figured out is cloud storage. Yeah, no, it has, and it got there 4 billion years before us. Because, so okay, cloud storage, just in case there's anyone in Silicon Valley who doesn't know what that is, if I take a picture on my cell phone of my cat doing something that is only interesting to me, and I drop my phone in the toilet, it's okay, because the picture has gone and been stored in multiple copies somewhere else out in the cloud on other computer servers. Well, microbes kind of invented that first. The core planetary gene set is in the cloud. It's in the cloud of 10 to the 30 individual organisms. You can't kill all 10 to the 30 organisms. Well, you probably could if you had a black hole and something, and, but that's another story. So it's a very interesting thing that I think suggests, it brings us back to the idea of cosmic mediocrity, because it's sort of suggesting a possible universal mechanism by which life gets going and preserves its critical information. By the way, this animation is an animation of chlorophyll and vegetation on the Earth with passing seasons. And I like to say this is gene expression. This is the largest version of gene expression you'll ever see. It's the core planetary gene set expressing itself. So, there's one other piece here. Given all of that, and I'm trying to argue that this would suggest that life may be abundant out there. There are tools, mechanisms, systems that life could latch onto that will make it much easier for it to survive, and it's all based on the same chemistry. But how diverse could that life be? I mean, is there going to be anything else like us? Because that's a question we often come back to. Can the pathways or trajectories be very diverse? Well, let's think about that, because that speaks to something that comes up again and again. And if any of you have read around this topic, you'll perhaps recognize this. And this is the idea that microbes, simple things like bacteria and archaea, might be the sort of organisms you'd find everywhere in the universe. But what about complex-celled life? What about cows and us? Our cells are different. They're much bigger, much more complicated, and we are in some ways much more vulnerable than microbes. So there's an argument that says perhaps complex-celled life, and a corollary to that is intelligent life, is very unlikely, very rare. Now, how are these arguments made? Well, the arguments tend to go along the lines of saying, look, if you go back through Earth's history, you can point to many features of Earth's history which all had to line up. It's a little bit like the Theanthropic principle. All had to line up just right for us to be here, for complex-celled life to be here. For example, we have a planet with a particularly large moon compared to the planetary size. And that moon helps stabilize the spin axis of the Earth. Actually, it prevents it from falling into resonances with the gravitational pull of Jupiter and Saturn, but that's a whole other story. It basically prevents the spin axis of the Earth from changing dramatically. If the moon wasn't here, Earth's spin axis would change by 50, 60 degrees over time spans of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, which would profoundly impact the climate of the planet. It would change it severely again and again and again. And complex life like us might have a hard time evolving in that situation. The configuration of the continents and the oceans on our planet, the nature of plate tectonics, all help stabilize climate. Again, that's something that could have been critical for us to eventually come along. There have been mass extinctions, and mass extinctions, whether it's an asteroid or something else, often allow, once it's wiped out a bunch of organisms, it opens up opportunities for evolution. It opens up opportunities for diversification of species. And so all of these things, if they were different, complex life might not have happened here. And the argument is that these things individually are quite unlikely. If you just pick a random planet around a star, it's quite unlikely to have any one of these things, let alone all of them together. And there's a piece of evidence as well in this argument that comes from biology. And it's a central one. It's perhaps the strongest argument for this notion of a rare Earth. And it's to do with a thing called mitochondria, which again you may well have heard of. Mitochondria are these structures inside our cells and the cells of any large multicellular organism that basically act like little power generators for our cells. They produce chemical energy for us. Bacteria and archaea don't have them. Because of mitochondria, our cells can express something like 200,000 times more genes than can a bacterium. And it's how we get to be big and energy intensive. However, some biologists have argued that the existence of mitochondria, which is so critical for us being here and for any large multicellular complex life, happened because of a single, incredibly unlikely merger of two simpler organisms 2 billion years ago. Two little things got together and entered into some kind of symbiotic relationship to form essentially the ancestor to our types of cells. But it was a very unlikely merger. And that means that while it clearly happened here, it's very unlikely that it's going to happen in many other places. Now, I'm going to try to tear that down a little bit. And this is a sort of maybe a little brief interlude, because I'm going to talk about baseball. And it's because these rare Earth arguments rest on saying that, you know, if this hadn't happened, if this hadn't happened, if this hadn't happened, we wouldn't be here. And those things that happened were each quite unlikely. So the net result is an incredibly unlikely event. But is that a good enough basis to say that life like us has to be rare in the universe? What I'm going to argue is maybe not. So let me tell you a story. Okay, so I'm sitting at home. The phone rings. On the other end of the line is someone who I haven't spoken to in a long time, a long-lost friend. They've tracked me down, they've found me. It's great, we have a wonderful conversation. They say to me, hey, you know what, I've got a ticket to this incredible baseball game tonight. Do you want to come? Sure. We meet up. We get stuck in traffic, we're late to the game, we get there, we can't get to our original seats, we have to walk around the stadium. As we're walking around the stadium, we stop because there's a great batter on the field, and we want to watch. The batter hits the ball, it sails into the air, and guess what? It lands in my hand. So I say to myself, that's incredible, that's so unlikely. Because if my friend hadn't called me, if we hadn't got stuck in traffic, if we hadn't been walking through the stadium, if we hadn't stopped at that moment, if the batter hadn't been on the field just then, I wouldn't have caught the ball. It's incredibly unlikely to have happened. But is it? Because in a big stadium full of spectators and a great batter on the field, a big baseball game, it's essentially inevitable that some spectator's going to catch the ball at some point during the game. And they too are going to be going through the same reactions. They're saying, oh, if I hadn't eaten that bagel, if I hadn't flushed my cat down the toilet, if I hadn't tripped over my shoelaces, I wouldn't be standing here catching the ball. It's unbelievable. So the point I'm trying to make is that the rare Earth arguments are a little bit like this. Things take on new meaning after the fact, except the difference with life being rare is it's like we're in the baseball stadium. We don't know how many other spectators there are. We know we've caught the ball, but we don't know how many other spectators could be out there, right? So the bottom line of this is if complex life is indeed rare in the universe, well, it's going to be sitting around thinking it's rare. if complex life is common in the universe, it's going to be sitting around thinking it's rare. So it doesn't disprove the rare earth argument, but it says, I think, that you have to be very cautious, because it could be the polar opposite, and we would still think that our circumstances were very unusual and that things had to be lined up just right for us to be here. So I know time is getting on, I'm getting close to the end here. So how do we pull all of this together? What, if any, is the conclusion? We've seen evidence for cosmic mediocrity, that we're not special. We've seen evidence on the other side that perhaps there is something unusual or special about our existence here. Well, I'm just going to sort of take a shot at this. I think that some of the key comes in examining the pathways that something like life can follow. Life is an extremely complex phenomenon. It may be the most complex phenomenon in the universe. And life, much like planets on wobbly orbits and the chaos of the formation of a solar system, life seems to occupy a place somewhere between order and chaos. Chemistry that's not too harsh or not too dull, temperatures not too cold, not too hot, a certain amount of order and disorder, but somewhere in between is the right mix. And that's kind of where life seems to pop out. It's an emergent and dynamic phenomenon. Now, this idea of emergence is something that has been around for quite a while in physics. Actually, it's been around in philosophy for a long time, but certainly in physics. And emergence, I'm going to show you just a very crude example of emergence, just to get your mind thinking about this, and to think that life might be an emergent phenomenon. So an emergent phenomenon is something that happens when you have simpler things that follow simple rules, but lots of them, and they all interact together, and then something new comes out of that you could not easily predict. So here, just for fun, is a picture of birds flying around. Now, this is a flock of thousands of birds, and you'll see as they fly around that, yeah, individual birds just flying around. If you just saw one bird, you wouldn't be very impressed. You wouldn't see very much. But put thousands of them together and something happens. Things emerge out of this. New structures, forms, fronts, shapes emerge. And it's very dynamic. They appear and disappear. A little more disorder, and you wouldn't see any of this. You wouldn't see these shapes. Too much order, and you wouldn't see these shapes. It's something that happens at that border between order and chaos. And it comes out of the net interaction of many smaller units, things like chemistry, things like molecules, things even like simple life forms like bacteria can exhibit emergence. So what does that do for us? Well, what I'm trying to say is, again, it's to do with the possible diversity of life, the possible pathways that life could take, because a solution to this conundrum between the evidence for there being something special or mediocre about life here and about us is that as unique or as special as we are, there may be enormous potential for other equally unique and special planets out there and for places for life to emerge in the universe. In other words, I'll argue that the logical conclusion to this sort of paradox, this conundrum between these pieces of evidence is that we may be special but not exceptional. So we can be unique but not significant. Yeah, we're special, but so are those guys, so are those guys, so are those guys. We're surrounded by equally complex, special, interesting life, perhaps, because then you can have your Copernican cake and eat it too. So, I have 2 more slides. An interesting thing here. Because obviously, to really solve this problem, we need to find other examples of life in the universe. That's something I've not really talked about tonight, but it's a big piece of the science that many, many people are pursuing today. But let's take it a little bit further. What if not just detect another instance of life independent from us somewhere, whether it's on Mars or whether it's on a distant exoplanet? what if we could really go out and begin to evaluate the total abundance of life in the universe? Never mind just the galaxy. Galaxy is kind of local and boring. Let's do the universe. Let's suppose we could do that. Well, how might we begin to try it? Well, we're taking baby steps. So for example, right now, we're beginning to find ways to look for things like the core planetary gene set on other planets. This little graphic is meant to illustrate the idea of looking at the chemistry of planetary atmospheres as starlight is filtered through them. So let's suppose we have a planet and it passes between us and its parent star. The starlight is shining through the atmosphere. Now, if you saw the lunar eclipse 24 hours ago, or less than 24 hours ago, and the moon looked kind of red, right? That's because the light from the sun was passing through the Earth's atmosphere, being diffracted and reddened, and ending up on the moon. So it looked kind of red. Well, the same kind of principle could be applied to looking at planets around other stars. And on the right-hand side is just a crude cartoon to illustrate that if you look at Venus, Earth, and Mars, and you look at the spectrum of light coming from them, whether it's through the atmosphere or reflected from them, there is a fingerprint. There's a fingerprint of the chemistry of those atmospheres. The chemistry of the atmosphere of the Earth is in part determined by the core planetary gene set. This kind of tool is something that astronomers are trying to apply to exoplanets right now. We can only do it for large planets that aren't very Earth-like in any respect. In the near future, we may be able to do it for a handful of planets that could perhaps resemble the Earth in some way. It's a way to look for biosignatures. Now, here's the really ambitious bit. Suppose we manage to do this. We figure out how to do this, and we can begin to do it systematically. And we can actually have some confidence that we're finding all the life out there. There are complications. Maybe life isn't always so easy to see. What would we get if we could not only measure the total abundance of life in the universe, because it's going to be a finite number within the observable universe. Right? If there's more life out there, it's a finite number, a finite amount. What if we could tie that to the fundamental physics that determines that number? Right? So this is like the anthropic principle, but now instead of just saying life or no life, we're saying how fertile is the universe and how is that related to deeper physics? Well, the really wild and ambitious thing, it'll come up here, is that we could determine our significance in the totality of all possible realities. You can wheel me off to stage left. It's maybe not so crazy to be thinking in these ambitious terms, because if we could figure out what it was that made our universe of a certain fertility, well, we could take those rules and we could ask about those 10 to the 10 to the 16 other universes and figure out how many of those might contain a certain amount of life. Now, what does that get us? Well, satisfaction. It gets us a certain satisfaction because we can actually put a quantitative answer to this question of our significance finally. Yes, life is something that happens in 1 out of every 10 to the 10 universes or something like that. I don't know what we would learn from that, but that's the point of why you would do it, because you don't know what you would learn. All right, my last slide. If you allow me to try to be a little poetic for a minute, because all of this question of significance or insignificance kind of assumes that we don't have any option but to accept what nature gives us. We're either special or we're not. And I think it's maybe nice just to end on a slightly sort of more open, upbeat note. Because there's another simpler option available to us. Because instead of saying, well, let's try and measure our significance, well, we can cheat. We can cheat. We can change our cosmic significance. We can. And we've started that already. We may not have realized it, but we've already started it. This is Voyager 1, launched in 1977. It's now some 12 billion miles from the sun. It's heading out into the beginnings of the interstellar space medium, the interstellar environment. This same pattern is a way in which we could alter that equation of significance or mediocrity. It doesn't matter whether there's other life out there in the universe. We could change our footprint. We could do something about it. Now, should we? Would we? Why would we? Well, I don't know, but it's something that is within our grasp, it's within our capacity. And that may be the one thing that makes us special, is that we have that option available to us. We can cheat the universe. We can make ourselves significant. I'll stop there. Thank you.
You talked a little bit about habitable zones around stars where water could exist in liquid form.
I don't think I've ever been cheered like that.
What about habitable zones around galaxies? Arguments have been made that the centers of galaxies are going to be too violent. They are likely to be nearby stellar explosions and maybe even gamma ray bursts. And the outskirts of galaxies, the amount of heavy elements will be too low. Doesn't that significantly decrease, although maybe not that much, the likelihood of life? What's the latest on galactic habitable zones?
Yes, so it's a great question. And I think right now we just don't know what the impact of those differing galactic environments is truly going to be. Certainly a lack of heavy elements may profoundly influence how many small rocky planets you can produce. However, we also know that stellar systems do migrate around in our galaxy. So it's not a totally clear-cut case that certain regions of the galaxy will be utterly devoid of planet-bearing stars. Then the question of the center of the galaxy, where there are many, many more stars packed together, and there may be supernova and other things going on to create a more difficult environment. Maybe a violent environment that either disrupts planetary systems or dumps radiation onto them. Again, we just don't know yet. Our ability to detect planets is still somewhat limited when it comes to looking that far away. I think it's an interesting point. I think it's something that would, if we could get to the point where we could systematically look for biosignatures, it would be very intriguing to see whether or not, assuming there are any positive biosignatures, whether there's a gradient, whether there are regions of our galaxy where clearly something went wrong for life. So not a great deal has been done about this because we're still in taking the baby steps to making real measurements. But it's definitely something interesting. And I actually think it would be really interesting to be able to look at an entirely different type of galaxy. For example, an elliptical galaxy, which is a great sort of fuzzy ball of stars, which typically has a different stellar population than a galaxy like ours. What's happening there? Maybe it's very different. Maybe it's barren. Maybe it's not. We don't know. It's a good question. So I'll be democratic. I'll flip back and forth, so we'll go to this side next.
Has the Earth increased or decreased in mass since the Earth's first days of existence?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the Earth, I guess, has increased a little bit in mass. And it's increased because, in some respects, the process of planet formation still hasn't finished. So every year, something like 40,000 tons of material, its meteorites and its cosmic dust, rains down onto the Earth and basically adds to the Earth's mass. So over time, that's a certain amount. It's not a huge percentage of the Earth's mass, but the Earth has gained something. Now, it's also probably lost something through its atmosphere, so I don't know exactly how the equation balances out. So the Earth is also a bit like a leaky boat, and the atmosphere is constantly leaking away into space. And some of the atmosphere includes stuff like water that's evaporated from the oceans, and also carbon dioxide that's come from volcanoes, so that carbon dioxide was ultimately in rocks. So there's going to be some balance to that equation, which I don't actually know. My guess is that the Earth may have gained more than it's lost, but it's not going to be a great deal. It's a good question. So I'll flip to the other side.
If a core planetary gene set in Earth can be strong enough to survive an asteroid crash, do you think that there's a way to use it to conjure it to create a medicine that would make someone so-called invincible to diseases?
So just say the last bit again. I didn't quite catch the...
Is there a way to conjure the gene sets to make a medicine that would make someone invincible to diseases?
Oh, I see. Okay. So to basically take the tricks of the core planetary gene set and to apply them to, wow, that's a good question. That's a very inventive question and an interesting one. Well, you know, I think there may be lessons to be learned from it when we examine the human microbiome, this mess of microbes that live with us. Because obviously if we take an antibiotic, that's a bit like taking an asteroid and throwing it at the planet as a whole. And seeing how we recover and how a planet recovers may give us some clues about the medical things that you could do from that. So it's a terrific question. It's a really good idea. I can't give you a much better answer at the moment.
Mine's not as good of a question as hers, but have scientists discovered another planet suitable for human life, like a backup planet? And if so, what is it called?
Ooh, gosh, is there a backup planet? Well, so I think it would be fair to say that right now, there may be 2 or 3 exoplanets, planets around other stars, that we think could perhaps be capable of supporting life. Now, I can't tell you what the names are because they're all numbered. They have horrible numbers like GL 581 and stuff like that, which you can never remember. But we don't know for sure because we're basing that on simply measuring where the planets orbit and how big we think they are. So we actually don't know whether they have things like water on, whether they have a water content. It's possible that the backup planet, the best backup planet for us, is in the solar system. And it's Mars. And people like Elon Musk have expressed this as, you know, maybe we should be thinking seriously about putting 1 million people on Mars as some kind of backup plan. Now, obviously, that's only a backup plan for a while, because as you saw, the solar system in 1 billion years' time is not going to be so nice for life, and in 5 billion years' time, it's all over. So really going to a backup planet around another star would be a very good plan. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll probably identify those planets.
So what do you think of the idea of panspermia, that is non-intelligence-driven natural processes that can transport life from one solar system to another?
Yeah, so that's also a great question. You know, it's an interesting idea. I think it's had a checkered history, that idea. It was originally brought up as a way to solve what was perceived to be a problem in explaining the origin of life here on Earth, because we couldn't quite see how chemistry could get itself together to make things like RNA and DNA and so on. I think we now have a deeper appreciation of things like emergence that might encourage that. And so people said, well, let's outsource the problem. We'll say that life here was started because it was seeded from something that came from space. The practicalities of panspermia, now the transferal of living organisms between planets of our solar system may be much more feasible. Okay, microbial life might be able to survive transit on a chunk of meteorite between Mars and Earth, for example. True panspermia that's between stars, I think, is a whole other order of magnitude difficulty. And if you add to that, perhaps, to say that it's not accidental, there's something out there that this is how it lives. It spreads through the stars, and it then seeds planets. It's going to have some strange biochemistry in order to survive interstellar space. There's a lot of radiation damage out in space. The temperatures are very low, and so on. So I think it's an interesting idea. And I think it's still an open question. Perhaps it would be helped if we find life on Mars and we discover that we're related to it. That would suggest that at least short-range panspermia does work. And then maybe that will open up possibilities for considering further afield panspermia.
Okay, so if light has been around since the Big Bang, then what % of the universe is the observable universe? Like what we can see?
Sorry, say it, the very last piece?
what percent of the universe is the observable universe?
Oh, gosh. Ooh.
Is it like infinitely small or something?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first bit of that, we don't know if life was around 13 billion years ago. Maybe there was some very early life. So the observable universe is just defined by the distance from which light has managed to reach us after 13.8 billion years. Now, how much more universe is there beyond that horizon? Some people have said, physicists who try to understand the deeper physics of the universe have said that the full universe may be 1 trillion or possibly a billion trillion times bigger than the edge we can see, which would mean that we're still a tiny, tiny thing. Our whole observable universe would just be a speck within just this universe, not even talking about other universes. I don't know if does that answer your question?
So that actually stole my thunder a little. So I've seen multiverse, images of multiverses usually pictured as sort of distinct spheres of sort of stuff, and not as sort of one big thing. And there should be nothing special about, a particular sphere in that sense, because we're just a small part of a bigger universe. At least that's what makes sense to me. Why is that distinct imagery used? Distinct spheres.
Lack of imagination. I guess it's used because, it's a representative of this observable universe, which is where light has managed to reach us. And if there are universes that have a closed geometry, so they have enough matter in them that they won't expand forever, then at least mathematically you might conceptualize them as spherical, although it's not really quite right because, space is expanding. People always ask this, so, what's outside the universe? Well, we're still sort of in the origin, and we always will be, and so is everything else, right? So I think that the depictions of, and I was guilty of it too, little bubbles or spheres is really more of an artistic convenience and lack of imagination than anything else. Oh.
Time is down to about 4 more questions.
4 more questions, okay.
So you said that there were planets that can orbit 2 suns, right? So how are they able to orbit 2 suns at the same time?
Great question. So they do it because they're orbiting way out here. So the 2 stars are going around like this, and the planet is out here sailing around safely. And it's actually very interesting because people weren't sure we would see any planets orbiting 2 stars like that, because when you have 2 stars are pretty big things and their gravitational pull is still strong out here. And that planet can still feel the fact that these 2 stars are going around each other. So it's not a great stable place for a planet to really be. So it was kind of surprising to find that planets had actually formed in those systems and are orbiting. But they have to do it a long way out. You can't, it would be nice if you could do a sort of figure-of-8 loop around the 2. And I'm sure there is an orbital solution that allows that, but it probably won't last for very long.
If microbials somehow became extinct, would all life on Earth end?
I'm sorry, if microbial life?
Yeah.
Ooh. Huh. Yeah, probably. I think, okay, so we cannot function without our microbes, right? Some people, I've heard microbiologists refer to us as cruise ships for microbes. We live to serve, right? Our only purpose, well, no, and there's something to be said for this. Our only purpose is to provide a specialized habitat for those microbes. And in order for that to work, we have to be completely reliant on them. So I think, there might be viruses left, but I don't know what they would do. So that's a great, wow. There's some really good out-of-the-box thinking here tonight. That's a great question.
2 more.
What would some signs be when the Earth slowly dies off because of the sun's heat? Is this significant or insignificant to our Earth's history?
Say the very first part of that?
What would some signs be when the Earth slowly dies off because of the sun's heat? Or not because
What
of
would
the sun's
some of the science be?
heat?
Yeah. Okay, so what would happen?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the sun, like any star that's burning hydrogen in its core, gets brighter and brighter as it gets older. Okay, so in fact, 3 billion years ago, the sun was 30% fainter than it is today, which is actually kind of a mystery how the Earth managed to stay warm enough. So what would happen is it's going to take a long time. There are systems on the Earth, natural systems to do with plate tectonics and all sorts of stuff, greenhouse gases, that try to stabilize the Earth's temperature. But as the sun gets brighter and brighter, those systems are not going to be able to respond. And some include life, but you don't have to include life. It's just geophysics. And so basically, the Earth is going to really, what's going to happen, I guess, again, a really good question, because this is at the forefront of trying to understand the nature of planets. One possibility is, as things get hotter and hotter, more and more water evaporates, okay? Water evaporates, it gets higher and higher up in the atmosphere. And it gets to the top of the Earth's atmosphere, and then sunlight actually breaks the water apart into hydrogen and oxygen. And the hydrogen can escape, because it's lighter. It escapes to space. And that means you'll never make that water molecule again. So the planet literally dries out. Okay? It actually loses water into space, effectively. And so I think that would be one of the key things that would happen, is the planet is going to dry out. But there are other things that would happen too. But actually the end state, we're not entirely sure what that end state would be.
Somewhere else affect the function of life on Earth?
How would finding life, or how would?
How would, like, if we detected life somewhere else, how would it affect life?
So that's also a good question. Let's suppose we find life, let's say it's on Mars or another planet, and there's something odd about it. Let's say it works differently than us, and we can see that. That would have big implications for our understanding of the nature of life here. It would tell us something about the nature of life's origins here. It would say, well, it can happen differently in other places. It might also point to different fundamental biological processes, and then we might be tempted to go and look to see whether those actually exist somewhere here on Earth. I think there's a misconception that we understand everything there is to know about life on Earth. We have no idea. We've seen this much. We didn't know very long ago that microbes, bacteria, and stuff like that were so incredibly important. So I think the biggest effect, it wouldn't be necessarily that, the aliens are going to come and get us, but it would be shaking our deepest sort of ideas about the nature of life here. I hope that's a reasonable answer. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Well, let's thank Dr. Scharf for joining. And I'm sorry we had to cut off the questions. We're going to continue the whole discussion, and Dr. Scharf is going to sign books right across the way in Appreciation Hall in just a couple of minutes. So if people will go over there. We'll be there in a moment.